Hey y'all, it's Mr. Delot again, and today we'll be talking about some more imperialism stuff, particularly economic motives for imperialism, and then going into a couple of specific instances of Europeans invading some of these places, both for economics and other reasons. But as we've talked about in class, basically economics are the number one reason for not just war, but imperialism too, right? There's a lot of people that argue that there are other ideological motivations. Sure, but they're just really convenient justification for the economic motives, right? Like when a European country takes over a place, they might say that it's because of spreading Christianity or because of military power or literally anything else, but it usually boils down to economics, either because they're extracting resources or it controls, a port that controls trade or something like that. Because ultimately, all these European countries are just trying to maximize profits, right? The British, the Dutch, the French, these companies that these countries found are trying to maximize profits. They build trade posts and forts to protect those trade posts before they do almost anything else with imperialism. The same way we've seen for the last 400 years with, for example, the Portuguese building trading posts and forts down the coast of Africa or Southeast Asia. And we see a lot of them using company power to sign treaties with local rulers, right? These East India companies that have that sovereign power to act like a country. And when they do sign these treaties, they're almost always exploitative of the natives in some way, whether it's an unequal balance of trade or outright conquest. And again, these East India companies have these quasi-governmental powers, which were originally formed to control the spice trade, if you remember. But it could be anything else too, right? Like the East India companies could control anything from spices to slaves to rubber to anything profitable. And speaking of those resources like rubber, the Industrial Revolution only increased the demand for those resources. And it increased the power of the East India companies, right? Like it drove further European expansion, and it meant that the Europeans not only needed more resources, but they had the ability to go out and conquer more land and get more resources at the same time. And then after they get those resources, they need new markets to sell those industrial products to, similar to mercantilism, but on a wider scale because of the increased scale of production from industrialization. So resources, cheap labor, and access to markets led to competition between European countries as well. So you see these East India companies become like one arm of countries that are trying to get one leg up on the other just because of nationalism and competition again. And none of them encapsulates imperialism really better than the British East India Company. They traded everything from cotton to silk to spices to indigo after driving out the Portuguese and ultimately defeating the Dutch East India Company as well. And by 1700, the British East India Company is the main power in India, trade or otherwise. They're the big instrument of British imperialism in Asia from at least 1834 until 1857, when company rule finally comes to an end in India after the Sepoy Mutiny. After 1620, the British East India Company traded slaves. They had the asiento from Spain for a little while. They imported opium to China in the 1800s in exchange for tea and other things, so they're behind the Opium Wars. Which were between 1839 and 1842. And ultimately, when the British East India Company defeats China, which, think about that, right? A company defeats what was, for thousands of years, the East Asian hegemon. They make the Treaty of Nanking, which is an incredibly unequal treaty for China, where it leads to 80 years of European domination in China. And basically what happened here was there was a trade imbalance, right? We've talked about how Europeans didn't really have any goods that the Chinese really wanted to buy, and the Chinese at the same time were demanding that Europeans pay in gold and silver, right, in cash. And so Europe was depleting its silver and gold resources while China was getting fat and rich. And so the British decided to grow opium in Bengal and in Afghanistan and trade that to China instead. Much to the chagrin of the Chinese government, because it was illegal to take anything other than gold and silver for the most part, and it was Chinese merchants opting to accept opium, not the Chinese government for the most part, because opium was illegal as well in China. And so that influx of private opium into China reversed that trade imbalance ultimately, and started basically draining Chinese silver, as well as creating hundreds of thousands of opium addicts in China. So it's a massive problem that the Chinese government failed to deal with. The British spent a long time trying to get the Chinese government to legalize opium and like tax it, and, they legalize it, tax it, make it part of the economy. The Chinese government said no because it's the pollution of Chinese culture by foreign culture, and also because opium is addictive and it destroys, people's lives and everything. And so the Chinese government said no. And ultimately what happens is, at one point, the Chinese government seizes all the British opium in Canton, which is the main British trading port at this point. And the British insisted that they needed to give it back because of free trade and capitalism and everything, and equal diplomatic power between the Chinese and British governments, but we've seen how that goes before. And anyway, what happens is the Chinese seize something like 2.5 million pounds of tobacco and 20,000 chests full of opium, which is tons and tons and tons of opium, in 13 factories and warehouses in Canton, and then they light it all on fire so that the British can't sell it. And if you're imagining this giant cloud of opium and tobacco smoke mixed rolling through the city streets of Canton, that's pretty much exactly what happened with the results you would expect, right? It was a minimum of 3 million pounds of opium that they burned kind of all at once, and it was hilarious and devastating to the city of Canton. But as we know from the Boston Tea Party, you can't just destroy what would be today billions of dollars worth of East India Company property and not expect any kind of retribution, right? So the British government demands that China pay for all the destroyed opium and tobacco. Of course, they say no, and so the Opium War starts. In 1839 begins what China calls the Century of Humiliation, where they're dominated by foreign powers completely after they lose the Opium Wars. And they have to make a bunch of concessions to Europeans, other than the British as well. They have to establish 5 trading ports in China. There's the Second Opium War in the 1850s. And in general, the Qing government is just kind of on a sharp decline. And then there's the Taiping Rebellion as well, where basically the bloodiest civil war in history by most accounts. From 1850 to 1864, something like 30 million Chinese get killed, maybe more, because the Chinese people were fed up with the Qing dynasty. They were fed up with a weak government that was ineffective, that was giving all these concessions to Western powers, that had allowed opium into the country and all these addicts and everything. And they saw it as a betrayal of Chinese culture, right? Like they're letting all this foreign influence in. So the Taiping Rebellion was at the same time both a traditional Chinese rebellion trying to hold on to Chinese culture and a rebellion in rejection of the Qing government. And essentially what happened was this guy declared himself to be the brother of Jesus. His name was Hong Xiquan, and I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, so I'll apologize. But he declares himself to be the brother of Jesus, and vows to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish what he calls the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which was this kind of weird, syncretic Chinese version of Christianity that he came up with. And it attracted a lot of people, particularly poor people that had been suffering under the Qing dynasty. And as you can imagine, at first the Europeans were really excited about this, right? Like they thought that there was going to be a Christian rebellion in China, and they would have a millions of people strong Christian surge in East Asia that they've been chasing for centuries. And so the European countries like Britain and France threw a lot of support into the Taiping Rebellion at first. However, it became clear very quickly that it was not actual Christianity. Again, Hong Xiquan is saying that he is the brother of Jesus, which is something that the Europeans don't agree with. And so eventually the Europeans pull their support, and the Qing dynasty ends up coming back and winning after 14 years. But the financial and political structure of the Qing dynasty never recovered after the Taiping Rebellion. They spent all of their money. They proved that their military was corrupt, outdated, and they lost millions of people again. It was the thing that really put the last few nails in the coffin for the Qing dynasty and allowed Europeans to come into China even more and exploit China even more. But anyway, we'll probably talk a little bit more about the Taiping Rebellion later. I do want to mention one other big East India Company that we've already covered a little bit, which is the Dutch East India Company. Remember, they have a government monopoly on all trade in the Indian and Pacific Oceans for the Dutch, from Cape to Cape, is what they said. So basically, from Cape Town, South Africa, all the way over to essentially Singapore. And of course, they concentrated on what you would expect the Spice Islands, Java in Indonesia, and the spice trade. Because remember, the Dutch come in and replace the Portuguese, and so they have the monopoly on nutmeg, cinnamon, cardamom, black pepper to a degree, things like coffee and bananas for a little while. And in 1799, the Dutch government took control and established the Dutch East Indies as an official government colony, which is basically just the same borders as Indonesia. And Indonesia eventually gets independence right after World War II because the Japanese take it from the Dutch, and the Dutch decide that they just give them independence. But anyway, one more thing we need to clarify real quick right here is just the shift to new imperialism, which we've already kind of talked about. But basically, after Napoleon, industrial Britain was the leading world power. Like, nobody could really match them. And they already had several colonies that were providing these new industrial resources like cotton, wool, rubber. There's a few other ones, like vegetable oil would be a big one. Jute is another one, which nobody realizes is important, but jute is the plant that they make burlap, the fabric burlap out of, which is really important for like industrial production and like sacks of things like rice and cotton and basically everything else. And all of this stuff is, again, to supply industrial factories. Other resources that have been important for forever are still important in the 1800s. Wheat, tea, coffee, chocolate / cocoa becomes even more important. Meat, butter, barley, all these other things that Europe needs to feed itself and feed the growing British cities and everything. And then these new colonies also provide a market for British goods, right? Like, British finished goods can only be sold so much before everybody in Europe has them. They need to sell them to the colonials as well, just like we've seen since the days of mercantilism, starting back in the 16 and 1700s. And that's another thing that really boosts British economic growth and European economic growth in general. Although there are only certain colonies that really do benefit from that, right? Like Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa would be the most linked to Britain by trade, just because they have enough middle class and upper class people that can afford a lot of those luxury and other finished goods from the British. But they still sold other things back to even the poorer colonies to make themselves rich, because what's the whole point of a colony, right? To make the mother country rich and to make the mother country powerful. And Britain really leads the world in terms of being rich and powerful from pretty much all of the 1800s. And they have some challenges, right? Like the Second Industrial Revolution in particular brings challenges from Germany and the United States to British dominance, although really it's not until after World War I that the United States really starts to surpass the British. But there are other people that start to build up their economies. There are other countries that start to colonize Africa and Asia and the Pacific Islands. It's not going to be just the Britain-only show for the entire time. But anyway, just to hit a couple more points that we haven't had time to go over really in class. We'll hit South Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Russia real quick, just to get a couple of bullet points down. Don't worry about the details for the most part, but imperialism in South Asia is India, more or less, but it's the same reasons that we've been talking about Europeans wanting to get there for a while, right? What does India have? Spices, that's the big one, as well as gems and access to other trade from East Asia, right? Britain, France, and Portugal all fought over all of that in India. Okay, Portugal was there first, right, with Goa from the 1500s. The French had coastal trading ports until 1763, when they had to give up their access and claims to India at the end of the 7 Years' War, because that's what drives the French out of North America and India, and sets up British domination of India with the East India Company. And basically, the British East India Company steadily conquered India for the next couple of decades. The Mughal Empire was incredibly weak, like on its last legs at this point. And basically, Britain ends up taking over all of South Asia, right? British India was not just the country India today. It was India, but also Pakistan, Bengal, or Bangladesh, Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka, and Burma, which is now Myanmar, right? Like, it was one huge colony that the British took over. And company rule lasted until 1857 after the September Mutiny, when the government ended up taking over India as the British Raj. But we will talk about that later. For other British territories at this point, we have Australia and New Zealand, two of the more important ones that are going to be very closely linked to Britain even today. At first, Australia is established as a penal colony, right? The prison colony in 1788 gets established as New South Wales, which is just like southeastern Australia. And by the 1820s, Britain had claimed and taken over the entire continent. But basically, for the first few decades at least, the convicts that they shipped over, right, it was the sentence was called transportation, because they wanted to get these criminals, these undesirables, out of England, and their prisons were full, so they would ship them off to the colonies. Georgia was gone, so they needed to replace it. Australia was the answer. And the convicts were the backbone of the economy until the introduction of the wool industry in the 1830s, when wool and sheep and everything became the mainstay of the Australian economy. And then eventually later Australia comes up with some other stuff, right? Like they get their own industry, they discover copper and gold, there's a whole gold rush in the late 1800s, early 1900s. New Zealand is eventually going to become its own colony as well. There's a treaty called the Treaty of Waitangi, where New Zealand becomes its own political entity. And the Crown in that treaty guarantees the native Maori people in New Zealand their own rights and certain tribal protections and stuff. Remember, we've talked about the Maori Wars before. And New Zealand has similar economic value to Australia, right? They have wool and dairy in general that are important for Australia and England both, just to like to feed the population, right? Like New Zealand cheese and textiles and stuff. But that said, Australia and New Zealand eventually also get like independence early compared to some of the other colonies. And there's also other problems in New Zealand, regardless of the treaty that we were just talking about. There was various wars between the Maori and the encroaching settlers that ended up popping up because when the settlers would encroach on their land, the Maori would fight back, as you can imagine. But anyway, to finish off the video here, we need to talk a little bit about Russia. We've already talked about Russian expansion towards the Pacific, right, with Bering and Catherine the Great. And it really is Catherine the Great that drives expansion in all directions for Russia, right? She takes Poland, chunks of the Ottoman Empire, Central Asia between 1760 and 1796. Russia is growing really, really rapidly. They also annexed big chunks of Finland, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia under Alexander I, like in the decade after the Napoleonic Wars, like which Russia really benefited from in general. And there were the Russian voyages all across the Pacific Ocean to Alaska and even down the coast of California in the 1740s. And the Russian-American Company was a joint stock company founded in 1808 whose goal was to make colonies in North America, which they did. They actually made a Russian settlement in 1811 called Fort Ross in California that was there for 28 years before they sold Alaska and gave up their claims to North America. So like Russia was in the colonial game for a while and even had claims on Oregon at one point to vie with the United States. But ultimately they turned their attention back to like Central Asia and Siberia. And in the 1800s, Central Asia becomes the focus with what they call the Great Game between Britain and Russia over dominance there, over the Silk Road trade and over Afghanistan and the opium and everything. And it focused mostly on Afghanistan, and for the most part the British won, but it's sort of unresolved before World War I starts, because nobody really conquered Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan's the graveyard of empires. So Russia and Britain both failed to take it over, but the British maintain a little bit more influence than the Russians do. And then the last piece of territory that the Russians take that you need to worry about is Manchuria. They took over basically the northern half of what had been Manchuria from China. And they actually still hold it today, like where the port of Vladivostok is. And right now in the 2020s, the Chinese are trying to get back, or at least have some goals of trying to get back that old chunk of Manchuria Russia took away from it. That's why the Chinese-Russian alliance is kind of faltering right now, both because of that and because of Ukraine. But anyway, that's a story for another time, so I'll see y'all next time.